We have Stephanie Kelton and Andres Bernal on to discuss the deficit myth, a new book written by Stephanie Kelton. And we're gonna have a discussion about the economy. Just to give you a little more of an introduction, Stephanie Kelton is a professor of economics and public policy at Stony Brook University. She's also a leading expert on modern monetary theory, which is what we're gonna discuss on the show today. And Andres Bernal was born in Bogota, Colombia, and immigrated to the United States as a child. He has a bachelor's of arts in philosophy from the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, and a focus on existentialism, political economy, and social theory. This is some heavy stuff, but I'm really happy to have you guys on the show today.
Nice to be with you.
Great to be here.
So let's talk a little bit about the deficit myth. Deficits have been in the news today. Bernie Sanders wrote a wonderful op-ed in the Washington Post about how the topic of deficits always comes up when it comes to government programs to help the poor, but it never comes up when we discuss, let's say, military spending. So what exactly is the deficit myth?
Well, it's not just a single myth. It's really a web of myths that's wrapped around this idea that the federal government ought to be budgeting like a household. And that when the government spends more into the economy than it taxes back out, that this is inherently wrong, that it's doing something irresponsible when it engages in deficit spending. And there are a number of myths that follow from this, the belief that these deficits are somehow a threat to our future, our children and our grandchildren, that they're going to do us great harm in one form or another, driving up interest rates, leading to crowding out of private investment and slower growth. I mean, as I said, lots of myths wrapped around this, but at the core is this idea that when the government runs a deficit, it is doing something wrong, it is ill-advised, and that it should be balancing its budget just like a good old household.
So how does that make sense? If the federal government is spending more than it's taking in, how is that not a negative for how the government's behaving? Could we, hit a wall at some point, and could there be serious ramifications? Like, at what point are we thrown off a balance that's healthy?
Well, okay, so a lot of people, this is a really good question because people really just don't understand much at all about the federal government's budget. And so when they hear deficit, it rings in their head as their own personal finances. And so it sounds like something that's risky, that's dangerous, that's bad. But what you just said is interesting because it's asking the question, what does the government's deficit mean for the rest of us? And so my example would be, suppose the government spends $100 into the economy, but it only taxes 90 of those dollars back out. Okay, that's a government deficit. But what we often forget is that if the government drops 100 in and only takes 90 back out, that the rest of us get left with 10. Every deficit is good for someone. And this is why the Republicans like to run budget deficits, because they understand quite well that deficits are good for someone. The government's deficit is nothing more than a financial contribution to some other part of the economy. The question is for whom and for what purpose?
So it's interesting because, just going back to the first question that I had, the government seems to have absolutely no problem when it comes to deficit spending to inflate the military budget. But what type of deficit spending would actually be positive for the country, for the American people? And what exactly is modern monetary policy? Because I see a lot, I've seen AOC bring that up, the importance of modern monetary theory. And I think that, bringing these issues up is important, but I don't think the vast majority of Americans really understand what any of this means. So can you break it down in layman's terms?
Hi, Anna. Well, that's a great question. And just to really quickly, when in your introduction, actually what I'm doing now is studying public policy at the doctoral level and advising many political candidates, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez during her 2018 race, and now some others that are now running for office as well. And it's a very important question because what the government can use an expanded deficit for are the things that we really need. the things that are very important for the people in this country. So, for example, canceling student debt, offering tuition-free public education, and most importantly, saving the planet with a Green New Deal. So these are things that at the moment we don't take action on because we're so afraid of this question of how are we going to pay for it, when in reality people have a deficit in things that really matter, which is their quality of life, our environment, the quality of our air and of our water, and our ability to be able to mobilize our resources to build a economy grounded in renewable energy.
So with deficit spending, we run up a debt. Am I correct in saying that? I want to make sure I get this right. Okay, so what happens?
Deficit spending adds to this thing that we call the national debt. Yes.
Right, exactly. Okay, so what happens as the national debt continues to grow? Like at what point does it become a problem?
Well, look, the risk of running budget deficits is not that you're going to run out of money, that you're going to bankrupt the country. The federal government's finances work very differently from the finances of a household, a private business, or even a city or a state. The city of Detroit is not like the federal government of the United States. Federal government of the United States is not like Greece, okay? The difference being that the US government is the issuer of the US dollar. And what that means is that the federal government is not constrained financially the way that you and I are, the way that Andres and I are, okay? So the question you're asking is, at what point could there be a problem? And the answer is that if the government, if Congress exercises the power of the purse irresponsibly, in the sense that they spend too much into the economy and the economy can't absorb all of that additional spending, that we're at full employment, there's no way for production to keep up with the additional strain, the additional demand, and you get inflationary pressure. So that's really where you want to look when you're looking for problems associated with the budget deficit. You want to say, is this deficit causing economic problems? Is it putting pressure on inflation? That's evidence that the deficit is getting too large. Today, we have a deficit that's right around $1 trillion and no evidence that inflation is pushing up against the Fed's 2% target, which is why, in my opinion, the $1 trillion deficits we have today aren't an economic problem. The $1 trillion deficits we have today are a problem in the sense that they're not being deployed in the broadest interest of lifting up the people who most need the help. These deficits are being run for the purpose of further enriching the people who are already doing extraordinarily well.
Yeah, you're exactly right about that. And one question that I have, and I believe it's related, you know, the Federal Reserve continues getting bullied into quantitative easing, right? So they keep lowering interest rates. And I'm curious what your thoughts on that are, because there are a number of economists that are really like ringing the alarm on that. They think that it's going to have a negative impact. Now, of course, the Federal Reserve is printing money and offering it to banks at incredibly low interest rates. That has lowered the interest rates for savings accounts for average Americans, and it's been negative in that regard, and it's been encouraging Americans to take on more debt. But how is that involved in the work that you do? Because I'm curious if you think that it's as much of a problem as other economists see it.
Well, look, so you mentioned the national debt in your previous question, and now we're talking about interest rates. And so what's interesting is interest rates have a variety of potential effects on the economy. But when the Fed holds interest rates low, one of the things that it does is it means that the interest that's being paid to bondholders is reduced relative to what it would have been if the Fed had been raising interest rates. So if you like, you say, well, you know, people who hold bonds tend to be wealthier people. And if they're receiving larger interest payments, that's bigger interest income for wealthier individuals. And so by keeping interest rates down, the Fed is, in a sense, depriving bondholders of a larger subsidy. So, you know, the Fed is keeping interest rates low. I'm not sure that I would agree that it's under duress or under pressure. The Fed is not doing QE at the moment. The Fed is just keeping interest rates low because, as Jerome Powell and others have explained, they're waiting for real signs that inflation is becoming problematic, that we're going to see signs of 2% and potentially higher before they begin to raise interest rates. So I think it's a perfectly reasonable monetary policy stance that the Fed is taking at the moment.
And really quick, just to add on to what Stephanie's saying, and your question about modern monetary theory. So what we're talking about here is an analytical lens that we use to think about the way that our economy already operates and the role of money in that economy. So a lot of people kind of misunderstand what we're talking about and think that we're just talking about this, printing money or things like that. But really, it's a framework to understand how things actually operate, and then have a conversation about how do we actually want to use government spending and for what political purposes. Mm-hmm. And many of us, we advocate for very progressive political purposes that have to do with improving the quality of life of all Americans and the world, really.
And really, that's an investment in the economy when you really think about it, because if people are educated, they have better paying jobs, and they have disposable income, then they have the ability to buy products. I mean, that's the way that the economy is supposed to function. And with this crippling inequality, it's becoming more and more difficult for middle class people to go out there and spend to stimulate. So this is super interesting work. Thank you so much for taking the time to explain it. Stephanie Kelton, the name of the book is The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to you as well, Andres.
No problem.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
All right.